Privatisation of England's water would come about in 1989, but was not a move towards true private ownership. As addressed in a previous video, it was private in name only. The structure is heavily influenced and directed by the state through heavy regulation, which has created regional monopolies. Companies own the infrastructure, but the state regulates and influences with negative effect. It is not a free market as it prevents three important pillars: competition, consumer choice, and market-driven price signals. The 10 regional water authorities that were privatised gained regional monopolies as 10 private companies in England. Consumers, in other words, were unable to switch providers. It is impossible for competition to enter the market due to regulatory and legal framework that blocks entry entirely. I've addressed before with the internal improvements in the late 19th century of the United States, hundreds of private companies would end up facing bankruptcy because of the fact that there's no risk-reward nexus. What that simply means is when the government subsidises, it's basically removing risk. What's the risk? Risk is basically the risk of you facing losses. In other words, in a free market economy, that is to say a capitalist system, you're forced to pay for your own losses. And especially when we speak about the private in name only, as the government is basically subsidising. And this was one of the major problems with that of the so-called private in name only water that you see in England. You would see that even in the 2008 financial crisis. The bad banks became too big to fail because of legally protected fraud. It encouraged bad behaviour because the government's always there to protect them from their losses. In other words, it's always a case where the taxpayer's forced to bail them out, so they get this type of system. And it's even in relation to the central banking system. That's why the central banks came about. Bad banks can basically get away with losses, and of course they can be bailed out.
And I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
And I've got government, of course, as well, can get away with large expenditure, living outside of its means because of that. Since they cannot compete for consumers or innovate to gain market share, their profits don't come from that of providing better service for consumers, but for trying to navigate their way through all of the government's red tape more effectively. The companies make money for financial games such as tax avoidance, hiding true costs, shifting profits to parent companies, also through taking on large amounts of debt as well as paying themselves big dividends, meaning paying large sums to shareholders even when the companies are failing. Infrastructure is in a mess, debt is soaring, and pollution is rising. So the reason why it's private in name only and not that of a free market, in other words it's not capitalist, is simply because of the fact that it's missing three components that's important to a free market, which is market driven price signals, as well of course market discipline, more importantly that of the incentives. Now of course the government has created negative incentives. Of course it has also destroyed market driven price signals. It's another thing I'll address. Completely destroyed that of discipline, because market discipline would mean you'd be facing with a risk reward nexus. You know, risk is being removed because government is the one that's subsidising it. The intention of Ofwat was basically to regulate the state regional monopolised companies. However, good intentions are often paved with dire consequences. As I touched upon in the previous video, the 1980s was far from a period of financial deregulation, as you saw a vast increase of government regulation or the private sector even under Thatcher's era. She might have deregulated specific things. It was a surface level deregulation, no different to that of the bus companies. It's really just the same when it came to the 1989 privatisation of the so-called private water in England. It was the same story, basically transferring from one form of socialism to something heavily socialist, with governments controlling and directing, and it's created a regionalised, monopolised style system, and governments creating negative influence. Again, this is something that I'll address. So the first problem that was created by Ofwat, the government regulatory body, and exactly what I was speaking about with negative influence. As discovered by the Independent Water Commission, Ofwat were rewarding companies for underspending on infrastructure, which they had basically classified as efficient. When a state regulatory body rewards and incentivises neglect, negative results follow. Companies therefore were incentivised to cut maintenance, reducing pipe replacement and delaying upgrades, while still meeting regulatory targets. You've got an issue where the companies are underspending because they're being rewarded for it by that of the government regulatory body. It's always a case where they'll look at that of the so-called private companies and they'll only concentrate on them. They'll completely ignore that of what the government regulatory body is incentivising, and it's basically incentivising spending less because they pass it off as so-called efficiency. So another problem that Ofwat had basically created, it failed to enforce proactive maintenance. As quoted on EPSU, on quote, replacement of water mains stands at just 0.1% annually, 10 times lower than the European average, while sewage discharges and pollution incidents have increased, off quote. The so-called private water companies adopted a strategy to fix on fail because Ofwat didn't require proactive renewal. As a consequence, infrastructure decay followed for decades, and again that's all to do with the negative influence of that of the government regulatory body. And this is the point that I'm addressing, because instead of people acknowledging what the government does, people just turn around and say, oh well, this is what happens when you privatise something, it's private and therefore this is why you need to nationalise it. Another negative influence that the government regulatory body, Ofwat, had enabled was financial engineering and the debt loading. As quoted on the BMJ, on quote, most water companies are now owned by private equity investors who have used financial engineering to boost shareholder returns via complex corporate structures that often involve tax havens. The companies have borrowed heavily. It is reported that current debt levels are in the order of 56 billion for the 9 companies in England. Interest payments, 1.3 billion in 2019, are passed off onto the consumers. Meanwhile, 72 billion in dividends have been paid to shareholders of parent companies since privatisation. This reportedly amounts to nearly half the sum those companies spent on maintaining and improving the country's pipes and treatment plants between 1991 and 2019. The companies pay little tax, and the remuneration of the bosses of English firms has raised eyebrows, amounting to 58 million in pay and benefits over the past 5 years. Directors pay dividends and debt service are all financed by the bill payers, many of whom face considerable hardship. By 2020, the price of water had risen by 40% in real terms since privatisation, and almost a quarter of households had difficulty paying their water bills. To put it simply, folk, the government regulatory body Ofwat did absolutely nothing at all to prevent that of the financial engineering or all the debt loading. So if it's all regulated and government regulatory bodies no doing anything, this draws back to the question again, well, who regulates the regulators? The government regulatory body, and government itself was basically responsible for creating 10 regional monopolies and prohibiting competition from entering the market. And of course, another negative influence that the government regulatory body imposed was to do with the price caps. Ofwat's price cap model incentivised financial manipulation, not service improvement. As a consequence of price fixing, the companies maximised their profits by cutting costs, as well as increasing leverage. The regulator encouraged high dividends, high debt, low investment, and minimal maintenance. As government's negative influence is creating these problems, when there's no risk-reward nexus either, there's a massive problem because the fact that there's no market discipline. This is exactly the problem with the entire so-called private market. The government's creating all these negative influences that has basically had a knock-on effect that's had neglect on the market itself, and people are looking at that and they're thinking to themselves, oh look, that's the fault of private companies. People in society only look at two things. They only look at nationalisation, and then they look at a style of private sector that's heavily regulated and directed by the state, like what I'm explaining now. It's like that third option they refuse to even acknowledge. They refuse to even accept the fact that there is a difference. So in other words, they're going round and round in circles, but this is the point. Private, name only, and nationalised, and the free market option doesn't even come to their mind. Instead, they just say, oh look, it's all the fault of private companies. And this is exactly what you're seeing today, because what are they arguing? They're arguing, oh well, you know, this isn't working, so now we need to nationalise it. You know, remember I mentioned in the previous video about Ludwig von Mises' book, The Middle of the Road Leads to Socialism? This is exactly what I was talking about, folk. Another issue that you're faced with this so-called private name-only market with the private water in England is that it was all fragmented. Fragmented oversight weakened enforcement. In other words, the Independent Water Commission discovered that regulatory oversight was divided across numerous agencies, creating gaps in enforcement and allowing companies to exploit regulatory blind spots. This meant that companies could legally become neglectful, stack up insurmountable debt while still meeting regulatory targets. Hello folk, I'm just in the middle of the video. I had actually just discovered that Ofwat, the regulatory body, has actually been abolished apparently. I think it must have been about a year ago. I wasn't aware about it because I don't really watch the news the same, to be honest with you. It makes you wonder what they're gonna do. What you kind of expect is, like with the corporatist system and everything, probably try and renationalise it. Like I says, it's always the same. That's their solution to every problem, and they always argue that.
Sir John Cunliffe was not given the option to look at renationalisation.
The argument still stands. My solution, of course, is the free market. Now that I've basically addressed that today with the private and name-only water in England, let's address this today with the nationalisation, because trust me, you're going to come across this argument all the time.
Between 1989 and 2023, not a single new reservoir had been built, and only minimal repairs to Victorian infrastructure were made, despite Margaret Thatcher's promises and her view that private business knows best how to run things.
And I heard this argument a couple of months ago, like I said before, speaking about how, oh, it was world class, you know, we had all these clean rivers and all the rest of it.
But just like in health and other vital public services, the first duty of a private company is to make profits, not provide universal healthcare or vital water supplies to their customers. Thames Water, for example, is very close to collapse due to its huge debt mountain. Since the middle of 2025, when a potential rescue deal for Thames Water fell through, the Westminster government has been preparing for the possibility of putting it into special administration, with the taxpayer being forced to bail it out, even though they are paying way more for their water than Scots do. However, any taxpayer bailout of English water companies will include taxes paid by Scots, so taxpayers north of the border will be forced to help bail out failing water companies in England, just as we did when the deregulated banks got into trouble in 2008. Scotland's publicly owned model consistently delivers better outcomes because it is run for the public good rather than payouts to rich investors.
And this was somebody, a fellow Scot, arguing that nationalised water across Britain was simply wonderful. You know, it's no different to how they painted the NHS, British Rail, when in reality, when you actually look at the history of these services prior to Thatcher, they were an abysmal failure. Now that we've addressed all that, let's touch upon the nationalisation. Prior to the privatisation of water in 1989, it was basically run by 10 state-owned regional water authorities. I've heard the arguments with socialists, among others, before, who are sympathetic of the nationalised service, especially the things like water, and their perception is often romanticised. In this case, they have a romanticised vision of the water before the 90s as the time of having clean rivers and efficient service where neglect barely existed, and one proponent went as far as basically to call it excellent.
The River Tees is an open sewer. Industry pours 500 million gallons of polluted matter into it every day and hides behind a law that obstructs the public's right to know what the effluent is. The human sewage from 500,000 people gushes into the Tees, most of it untreated. The net result, even 20 miles upriver, at what was once a beauty spot, the fish are dying.
Water nationalisation, much like the coal industry, British Rail, the NHS, was facing structural decline. There was chronic underinvestment, as I touched upon in the previous video, similar to the NHS. The state is faced with the economic calculation problem. It is also faced with political neglect, and similar to that of the present, widespread environmental failure.
Oxygen has almost disappeared from this water. Today, the discharge from industry is 17 times greater than in 1931. Tests show that the quantity of cyanide alone has increased by 100%. The law says that the River Authority must take the level of pollution in 1960 as acceptable and control only the excesses since then. But in 1960, the pollution level was anything but acceptable. A massive sewage treatment scheme has been 5 years in the planning and still awaits detailed approval. In the meantime, new housing pumps even more untreated sewage into the Tees.
Like I touched upon, the government regulatory body Ofwat has resorted to price caps. So essentially it's resorted to price fixing. If you're going to price fix, you're going to face a serious problem. And that is to say, no different to the NHS, how the hell is the central planner supposed to know where to invest and where to stop investing in? It doesn't know the most urgent required areas to fix. It doesn't know where to allocate the resources. You could say, oh well, it was the 10 regional monopolised private companies, it's their job. But there's the issue, the government regulatory body has fixed the price, so how the hell are the companies supposed to know where you're going to allocate? Because there's no price fluctuation, there's no information of profits and losses. So if you've not got the information of profits and losses, how are you supposed to know where to allocate resources to, where it's more urgently required? You don't. Since there was no financial freedom, budgets were controlled by the Treasury, not the water authorities. The state consistently placed other priorities or the infrastructure for water, causing neglect. Therefore, investment collapsed, which left the nationalised water with an estimated £24 billion loss by the late 1980s. The neglect meant all of the infrastructure were ageing faster than they could be repaired or replaced.
The English model is so uniquely bad that no other developed country in the world has fully privatised its water supply. Yet in Scotland we are told that we cannot run things as well as England posing as the UK. So when English politicians, including those in Labour, which once championed public ownership of water, tell Scotland that Scotland's performance is on a par with England's or worse than England's, they are lying.
This is the historic town of Kinghorn, a quaint seaside spot once favoured by the Victorians, but its sandy shores are under threat. This burn contains raw sewage and it's pouring right onto the beach.
What was Thatcher to do? You've got ageing infrastructure, you've got a government that's neglectful, so the government itself is the problem. Like I said with the economic central planning problem, it's not just something that's solely confined to that of a fully centrally planned system. And of course it was ageing faster than they could actually repair and replace. Well, the mistake that she made is not the fact that she privatised it, it was the fact that she vastly increased the regulatory burden or the private sector. And people are running around saying, oh well, she deregulated the market and the unregulated markets caused the banking crisis. Nonsense. So it was hardly wonderful. Furthermore, folk, the romanticised vision that these people have is blown apart, as many of the rivers were heavily polluted and some becoming biologically dead, simply meaning unable to support fish, etc. The beaches often failed European cleanliness standards, and sewage spills, similar to that of the present, were all too common, as treatment capacity couldn't keep up with that of the population growth. This led to Britain become known as the dirty man of Europe. Britain is currently sitting, pipelines are from the Victorian era. It cannot keep up with the vast growth of the population presently, as that you've got the drainage water as well, of course, the sewerage water basically combining under one pipeline. It's causing the ore spillage. That's what's causing these spillages of sewerage into the rivers and stuff like that. You need infrastructure upgrade of the water market, and the government is disincentivised that. Again, similar, there was a problem with the bureaucratic fragmentation prior to the creation of the regional water authorities in 1974. Services were divided across hundreds of the local bodies. Even after 1974, the system was inefficient as investment decisions were political rather than that of economic. So there you go, folk. The nationalised water was faced with the same fragmentation problem in relation to the central planning and of course the economic calculation problem. There's no market incentive, there's no market discipline, as I pointed out. You've not really got a private market in England today, and so what you've ended up with is just more of the same. And again, private ownership gets the blame here. By the mid-1980s, the nationalised water was struggling to keep up with that of the decaying infrastructure. It could not raise the capital to upgrade it. All we did was replace one failed socialist model with that of another in the name of the private and name-only industry whilst maintaining regional monopolies. We just replaced one monopolised model under socialism with more monopolised shite. So when it comes to anything that's subsidised by the state, the government's basically going to guarantee that those companies survive, because after all, they've got to ensure that there is provision. Again, there's no risk-reward nexus, there's no market discipline, so what you end up with is incompetence. The reason why losses are so important, it's a self-regulating property, folk, to put pressure on you as a business owner. If you do face losses, you've got an incentive to then make changes. You've then got an incentive to innovate. You've got an incentive to stop doing what's been causing your losses and to change direction. When you subsidise losses, it basically means somebody else is paying for their losses. The government's forcing the taxpayer basically to pay for their losses. They're essentially getting to live for free off of all that. That's not a self-regulating property. They're basically being rewarded regardless of their performance. The first step is allowing the free market competition to flood the market. That way that there are more than one provider in each region. This gives the consumer basically the choice so that they are able to switch providers if they so wish to do so. That's not to say get rid of regulation completely, but have sensible regulation, simplify the regulation, creating a competitive market where competition is able to flood the market so that consumers then have the choice. The second free market solution that I would offer up would be to separate infrastructure ownership to that of the service provider ownership. You would have a neutral owner that would own the infrastructure with a simplified regulation is to basically maintain the infrastructure and ensure there's open access for that of these, private companies, basically so that they've got open access to the water market. The neutral utility itself would not be the one that sells the water, it simply provides the structure that the private companies operate in. Since it is not the competitor of the market, there is no incentive for it to block new competitors or favour current competitors. The private competition would compete to deliver the water services. The companies would buy wholesale access to the network and compete for households and businesses, offering competitive prices, cleaner water, more reliable service or innovative technologies such as smart metering and leak detection systems. Given there is market pressure from competition, companies are pressured to ensure quality service to earn customers. This solves the problem to prevent duplicating pipelines which would cost more and prohibits the monopoly abuse. They're not being subsidised, those companies can face losses in the free and open market in the water place, those companies can easily go under. So the consumers are getting better quality service. Relative to that of fixing the problem that you've seen in England today and why it's absent, is to do with that of full metering and that of the price transparency, which is two important things that you would have relative to that of fixing the problem that you've got. A free market requires the full metering and transparent pricing because markets only work in that of the reliability that consumers know what they are paying for. In England, presently, people are not paying for usage but property value. This means that a family family living in an average home could end up paying more than a single person living in a large property, even if the family uses much less water. The other problem with that is the fact that the consumers have no incentive to conserve water as they are not paying for the usage. It's a case where conserving is something that's just no done in that type of system. There's inefficiency. Because it ensures every household and business pays the accurate quantity they use, this incentivises customers to make informed decisions on reducing costs, fixing leaks, choosing the water provider that has better prices or conservation incentives. Also, because of the market-driven prices, it exposes inefficiencies more easily to fix those problems as losses direct resources more efficiently, something the government price-capped system can't. That's the problem with a nationalised service. It's the problem with a government strongly controlled and regulated private name-only service like you've got in England today. There's inefficiency because it's price fixed. In correlation to do with the subsidies, getting rid of that. In fact, I would argue to outlaw the subsidies. Prevent it entirely. A free market solution would be to allow the bankruptcies. So this ensures that the failure is not being rewarded. It self-regulates, pressuring companies to provide more efficient service, ultimately leading to better quality service for that of the customers. If you've not got the risk-reward nexus, you're not going to run anything efficiently. The polluters are then made to pay for their own damage, right? So in other words, you're not forcing taxpayers to pay for your losses. If you're causing damage, which is going to cost you, after all, remember what I say is, if you want to maximise your profits in companies, their incentive is to make more profit. Well, if your incentive is to make more profit, how do you make more profit? You maximise your profits by minimising your costs. It's going to cost you more to face losses because you're going to cause damage. It's going to affect your profits. It's going to incentivise them to make changes. That's going to incentivise better behaviour. Again, it's self-regulating. Again, that's not something that's present in the current model because they get to navigate around that of the regulatory loopholes. Allow private capital to flood in to build infrastructure and stuff like that. Now, it wouldn't really be the role of the neutral owner that owns the infrastructure. It's just there to give open access. But in terms of these private companies, they can contribute building their own infrastructure. And the beauty of it is through that competition and innovation, and because of the neutral body, it gives open access to that infrastructure for all the rest of the companies. And of course, because of competition and innovation, it's improving the service, and of course that infrastructure is openly accessible to everybody. It's not like the current system today where everything is somewhat centralised with regional monopolies and therefore all benefit just from competition and innovation that creates a better marketplace. Anyway folk, if you like the video, be sure to like the video, share the video on that. Of course, if you get anything you'd like to add in yourself, comment in the comment section below, and of course I'll be sure to get back to you. Thank you for watching, and I shall talk to you later. Cheers.